We're very excited to welcome you today to the Boost CAYC's webinar, the C Word, talking about consent with youth. My name is Miriam Selick, and this is Ayla Lefkowitz. We'll be leading the webinar today.
Yeah, so I want to share a little bit about who we are. So again, my name is Ayla Lefkowitz. I'm the co-executive director of Canvas, and I do most of the development and partnership side of the nonprofit. And a little bit about me, my background is in public health. I'm a sexual violence prevention expert. I've worked in both sexual health centers as well as sexual assault centers, doing education just like this on consent and sexual violence prevention.
And again, my name is Miriam Selick. I'm the co-executive director of Canvas, and I oversee all of our programming. My background is as an educator and a teacher, and I've been teaching and working with youth for the past 10 years. And so we're really excited to share some of our learnings with you today. So in this session, we'll be talking about how service providers, parents, teachers, and other professionals can talk with youth about consent, with the goal of laying the foundation for healthy, positive relationships.
So some of the things we're going to go through during this presentation, first we're going to understand some of the common concerns and questions youth have about consent, get an understanding of what are youth even thinking about consent. The second part is really learning teaching techniques for how to teach consent and how to teach about our society with regards to consent. And then our last part is focusing on increasing confidence in answering tough questions and going through some of the questions that youth often bring to this discussion.
So as a quick overview for today, we'll give you a little bit of background about the work that Canvas does. Then we'll be looking at what consent looks like over the lifespan. We'll be talking about social pressures and messages that youth are exposed to. We'll review, what does consent actually mean and how you can explain that to youth. Then we'll get deeper into the topic, looking at how to discuss responsibility, common obstacles to consent that youth identify, and assumptions that youth may be bringing to relationships. We'll also explore some tools we use with youth to address concepts like verbal and nonverbal cues and language to check in with the partner. And then we'll end by talking about some do's and don'ts for adults and common questions that youth have in relationships. Again, please feel free to submit questions at any time in the presentation, and we'll take those up at the end.
Okay, fabulous. So to tell you a little bit more about Canvas, so we're a nonprofit organization that's based in Toronto. So Canvas Arts Action Programs has been around for 4 years now, and our mission is to use interactive education to combat homophobia, transphobia, and sexual violence. So the organization's mandate is to work with all youth populations. That could be in schools, at camps, and in community centers, and ensuring young people have a strong foundation of knowledge when it comes to consent, boundaries, and skills for healthy relationships. Yeah, so when it comes to our solution, here are some of the ways that we do this to achieve our goals. As I said, we lead interactive workshops, so that would involve different activities, discussions, and really getting them involved rather than a lecture from someone where they just have to listen. We work with grades 6 to 12 on consent, as well as LGBTQ2S+ inclusion and gender equity, although we'll be focusing on consent here, and as well as we do trainings for educators and youth workers. So in the last year, we've worked with almost 4,000 youth, as well as providing trainings for thousands of adults and working with young people. So we believe that there are some key aspects in bringing education on consent with youth and educators. So first, young people need to understand why this is important. And the way that we do that is to have them have a more personal connection to the topic, ask them questions of how it relates to their life. At that point, we do train educators on how to have those tough conversations, in introducing the topics in different ways and how do we define it in a way that youth will understand. And at the last part of it, we really want to focus on practical skills for safe, positive relationships, giving both youth and educators knowledge of what to do in situations. So today we'll be focusing on exploring how to have the conversation about consent with youth.
And so Canvas works with a number of community partners, including the Toronto District School Board, Peel District School Board, the 519 Church Street Community Center, Regent Park Community Focus, Sketch, and Eva's Initiative for Homeless Youth. So when we're talking about consent, we really want to take a lifelong view, because one of the most important things is that we're not bringing consent in when youth are already teenagers. We want this to be a conversation that is happening at every stage of their lives. Lessons that we teach children about body ownership, checking in with themselves, respecting other people's personal space will really prepare them to have skills to create healthy relationships further on in their lives. It's also really important that as adults, we're modeling consent behavior in our interactions with children and youth. You know, if you tell a young person they have to ask before touching someone, and then we touch them without asking, it's of course sending a message that consent doesn't matter. So modeling is a really key part of this whole conversation. So of course, when we're talking about consent, we do want it to, like I said, follow along in an age-appropriate fashion. So when we're talking with young children, that conversation is really focused on body ownership, personal space, asking for permission, teaching kids they have agency to say yes or no about their bodies. And as I said, really having adults model the behavior, especially at that young age. So asking things like, can I give you a hug? Do you need help in the bathroom, or should I wait outside? Letting them know that they have those options, and also encouraging them to ask other people. As kids get older and we enter the preteen years, it is important to, of course, continue the conversations and lessons that you've been giving about consent in non-sexual contexts, but also to recognize that there are a lot of sexual messages that are aimed at kids in this age group. And so it's really important to start addressing what consent looks like, specifically when it does come to sexuality and relationships. So some of the key things that we focus on here is talking about decision-making skills, respect for others, care for others, and really getting at this idea of empathy for other people, and being able to identify for themselves what are their wants, what are their needs, which at that age can be very confusing. So some of the things that we like to talk about with this age group, when it comes to sexual pressures, youth are receiving sexual messaging from almost all forms of media, and these sexual pressures can set in very early. So one key thing we talk about is teaching media literacy and educating youth around making informed choices. Specifically when it comes to social media, youth with access to the internet may be seeing images they're not ready for, and might be taking part in activities like sharing photos of themselves and their friends that they take for granted and don't really pause and think about, well, is there actually consent to share photos? So bringing it in those moments is really key right from the start. And so again, we know that just telling a young person not to do something means they're more likely to do it. So what's important instead is teaching them how to assess risk, take safety precautions, and think about their choices. So when we go to the next age group, working with teenagers, again, these conversations continue, but a few more aspects are really important to bring into the conversation. So with alcohol and drugs, this is one of the most common areas when we speak with youth where they're experiencing confusion over what consent means and how it applies. We're going to be talking about this in a lot of depth later in the presentation, so I'm just going to leave it there for now. Another major conversation source is the idea of coercion. So moving past the idea of, did someone say yes or no, and helping youth identify different types of pressures and coercion that might influence how someone feels that they can actually express themselves. So, often there's confusion over if they said yes, well, then that means yes. So being able to understand what pressures might someone be facing. And then finally, we think it's really important to be talking about rape culture. And so when we say rape culture, what we mean is a culture where sexual assault is seen as normal and victims are often blamed. And so right now, all we have to do is look at politics, look at some of the things going on around us, and you'll see how confusing messages about assault and consent can be. So it's really important that we're supporting youth to think critically about the society that we live in, helping them to analyze the messages that they receive in media, consider other people's viewpoints, always moving from a place of empathy. By having conversations at all stages of development about consent, youth will learn skills to increase their own personal safety in relationships and also reduce the risk of youth assaulting, coercing, or causing harm to others. And that's really that key point of recognizing that we all have the capacity to be harmed or to cause harm, and making sure that we're providing them with skills to prevent both. So while, as we've been talking about, consent can and should be discussed at every age of the lifespan, today our talk will focus specifically on consent with youth 13 to 18 years old. Of course, this is a somewhat broad category in terms of experience and maturity level. However, the materials in our talk today can be tailored to any of these ages. The most important thing is creating a space for youth to share their own perspectives, ask questions, and guide the conversation based on experiences that they are currently having.
So this slide is really talking about where are we learning about consent? Where are youth learning about consent? So outside of the classroom, if it is taught in the classroom, they have ideas about sexual violence and consent everywhere, from advertising to music to books to movies, and specifically romantic comedies and pornography. So although the numbers vary according to a study conducted in 2008 by Taylor Cahoot at University of Western Ontario, between 7 to 59% of adolescents are accessing porn intentionally. So yes, that's a very broad percentage, but it's getting at the point that there are so many youth that are accessing pornography, and these are only the ones who are self-identifying. Again, it says intentionally, so a lot of the time, because of how our internet is set up, there are often times that youth will come across different pornography that they didn't have the intention to see. And they didn't choose that that's what they wanted to see. So it is one of the main sources where youth get their first introduction to sexuality and model for relationships. So regardless of one's view on porn, it can certainly impact young people's assumptions of what sexual relationships look like. So when they're viewing porn, youth viewing mainstream porn sites are unlikely to see any off-camera discussions related to consent. They only see what is shown, which is very, very rarely any representations of consent. They may also be seeing BDSM without a full understanding of whether there was consent or not, and it can often come out looking like violence. They may not be using ethical websites, in which case they may be viewing people engaging in sexual acts without consent, and they may be seeing violence and misogyny they don't understand, and they may see very scripted acts which don't represent what actual sex or relationships look like. Usually don't see protection, they usually don't see conversations related to consent with language around like, does this feel good, can I do this? That does not come up, not in porn, but also not in movies. So it is vital that we have these conversations with youth, where adults let them know that sexual curiosity is normal and it is healthy. However, they need to apply a critical lens in the same way we talked about media literacy in general. They need that same kind of media literacy for this kind of content. And understanding that it is not reflective of real life. So because we typically don't discuss porn, even if kids learn about media literacy in other aspects of their life, we need to continue to discuss it and question the fact that this is a taboo topic, because they are seeing it, and we need to change the narrative and give them alternative narratives to what a healthy sexual experience can look like. So even in those less explicit media, so when it comes to music videos or movies, we are constantly getting messages about consent in relationships. So if you look at romantic comedies, behaviors like stalking and not taking no for an answer are portrayed as romantic. And very few love scenes show the characters talking to each other. Instead, the music swells, they look into each other's eyes, and both seem to magically know what each other wants. So obviously, if this is what they're seeing, that is what they think sexuality is and what is the ideal of what a sexual act should look like. So we don't have those good examples of what it looks like to check in with a partner and to ask for consent. Neither of these areas show good examples of what it might look like to have that kind of healthy relationship. In music videos, we often see women being objectified and not their wants or needs being respected and seen as valid. So what we're saying with this is that while we can't control what our society is giving to youth, and we can't always control what they're getting, whether it's from the mainstream media or social media, it is important for us to talk to kids while watching this type of media or outside of it, helping them identify some of the problem areas and give them a critical lens to analyze what they see.
All right, so we've been talking a lot right now about this idea of consent, and I think it's really important that we define what we mean by that, and also look at how you can define consent when you're talking with youth. So there's an acronym that we really like to use. It's not our acronym. It is from Planned Parenthood in the States, but we find it works really well in laying out specific points that help young people understand what is necessary for consent. So the acronym is FRIES, easy to remember. And, the first idea is that consent needs to be freely given. So what this means is that it is given totally free from pressure, coercion, and manipulation. And as we've mentioned, often there's this idea that, well, if someone said yes or they didn't say anything, then they were fine with what happened. But again, if there was pressure, if there was manipulation or coercion, it's really important that youth are able to identify what that looks like and recognize that that's not valid consent. Another key idea that we talk about is the idea that consent is reversible, which means you can take it back. So just because you said yes to something, once things start up, if someone feels uncomfortable, they don't want to be there anymore, they aren't held to that yes, they're able to take it back. I think this one is interesting because it's really easy to talk about and really hard to do. Often when I'm doing this in workshops, I'll ask youth, can you think of any situation in your life where you said yes to something at first and then partway through you got kind of nervous and thought, I don't want to be here? And they always raise their hands. Everyone's had that experience. And then I'll ask, well, was it easy? What happened? Were you able to say no? And even in, they're doing sports, they're doing some other type of activity, they'll say that there's a lot of trouble in them being able to take back that yes. So being able to talk openly about the fact that consent is reversible is really important. We'll also say that often when we're talking with youth, especially with young men, they will bring up a worry or a fear that reversible consent means that if someone says yes to them, that they can take it back after and accuse them of assault. So it's really important to emphasize if this question comes up, having you think, well, why might that person have said yes if they didn't feel comfortable? What was the context of the situation? And going back to that idea of, was it really freely given? So the next idea that we talk about is consent needing to be informed. In other words, all parties have to understand what it is that they're agreeing to. Often at this point in a conversation, I'll bring up a discussion around drugs and alcohol. With the context that all parties need to be able to understand what's going on and have the capacity to give consent. I also explain it by saying that there can't be any extra information that might cause a person to change their yes. So some examples that have come up in conversations with youth is one young person described sharing a photo with a partner, but not being informed that that partner's parents routinely looked through their phone. So had they known that, they wouldn't have shared the photo. So even though they had said yes to sharing it, it was not informed consent. Similarly, there's often a discussion of someone who says yes to sex, but was not informed that their partner had an STI. And so again, that was not fully informed consent. A major idea we talk about is the idea that consent is enthusiastic. This means, not that someone has to be jumping up and down with excitement, but more the idea that consent is active. So if someone senses reluctance or hesitation, saying, well, then this is a time to be rechecking in with the partner, that it's not just the absence of a no. And finally, we talk about consent as being specific or for every act. So just because a person has said yes to one act doesn't mean they've said yes to others. And for every new act, there needs to be a rechecking in with the partner. So in general, when we're discussing consent, of course, it's important for youth to have an understanding of legal definitions, but I think we also all know some things are legal but can still be harmful. And so I think it's really important to go past that definition and also talk about consent as a form of care, of caring for the other person, whether you know them well or not, and having respect for them. So we're going to be looking at how you actually do some of this in action.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so once we go through our FRIES definition, we like to ask youth, whose responsibility is it to get consent? And it's always interesting to hear what their answers are. Sometimes they'll say, it's everybody's responsibility, or they'll say, it's my responsibility. Or sometimes with these gendered notions, they'll say, I think it's men. Men should be the ones asking. So there's certainly parts of their answers that might be correct. Certainly, yes, everyone should be responsible, but we want to emphasize the idea that the person initiating the act is especially responsible. So an example of this might be, instead of taking a pencil and waiting for the person to say, I don't want you to take that pencil, we are having the person who is initiating the act take the pencil, to asking before they take the pencil. So, can I have the pencil? Obviously, this is a very basic understanding of it and gets a lot more complicated when it comes to sexual acts. So when it comes to sexual acts within one sexual encounter, the initiator might change. Someone might initiate one act and someone might initiate another. And just as Miriam talked about, we need it for every act, that it is so important to understand, when we are starting something new, we need to be asking. So we say regardless of gender or level of intoxication, sexual history, relationship with a partner, because a lot of the time these are the things that youth focus on that think that it complicates things. So when it comes to gender, we say it doesn't matter who is there. If you're initiating, that is your responsibility. So it could be in a heteronormative relationship. It could be the woman who's initiating. Also understanding that there are lots of genders, non-binary folks. There's a lot of relationships that are not just straight relationships. So complicating that idea when we're talking about consent, as well as talking about even when you're drunk, you still have that same responsibility. Even if you have had a sexual history with that person and you've had sex many times, you still have that responsibility. And even if maybe you've been married for 10 years, obviously not with youth, but whether you've been together for a year or 20 years, you still have that same responsibility. And that is something we'll talk about a little bit more in terms of assumptions that people have. Yeah. So in all these cases, regardless of what youth may assume about their partner, we can work to ensure that silence doesn't get confused with a yes, and we move to a more active version of consent. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. So this is some of the next part. We often ask, what are some obstacles? So what are things that get in the way of us being able to have a freely given consent? So this is a word cloud of a whole bunch of things that often come up, and we ask this to youth first and then add any that we want to add, that we think does affect them. And it's so important to be talking about obstacles because it is things that come up that they might not even realize are there. So for example, you see awkwardness on it, that, this is the single most common thing we hear when talking about youth, when talking to youth, and one of the major barriers that they don't feel comfortable using their words. They don't want to ruin the mood by asking their partner what they want or by sharing their own wants. And there's often fears that saying no will make things weird or going forward, or even complicate things with their larger friend group. So this means that often young people don't feel comfortable to check in verbally for fear of awkwardness. And like we talked about before, they don't have these examples in their movies of what it might look like. Alcohol, of course, is a huge one. At this stage, a large percent of sexual activity is taking place while youth are using drugs or alcohol. So this can severely complicate things, and we'll be looking at this in more depth very soon. Again, power dynamics we'll also be looking at. And we're talking not just about power dynamics that like employer, employee, teacher, student. We're going to be talking about age. We're going to be talking about social status. We'll get into that a little bit more later. Again, relationships. So sometimes, there are emotional pressures that people feel they should do something because, they might really like them, but they might still not want to do that. So expectations from their partner, they might do certain asks to make sure that they still stay in the relationship. And there might also be expectations from friends that if you're in a relationship or if you're with someone that you should be doing something. And that mixes also to peer pressure. There are also pressures not to use protection. And many youth do not understand that if they're pressured to do this, so if they want to have sex, but they want their partner to use a condom and the partner doesn't use a condom, that makes the act non-consensual. So one young woman we worked with told us a story like that of her boyfriend repeatedly pressuring her into having sex without a condom. And she felt she had to say yes because she loved him and didn't want to upset him. And that is a strong example of what that kind of emotional pressure can look like. So a few other obstacles, youth don't understand that they might have the right to say no in certain situations. They might have pressures from themselves. They might have to reach a certain sexual level at a certain age. They might feel pressure that they said yes to certain acts, but they didn't say, so they just kind of assume that they should do everything. They might feel that they want to be polite and they don't feel comfortable saying no. And many of the youth we talk to identify gender as an obstacle to consent. So for some, this means that different social expectations we have of men and women, including stereotypes that men are always perpetrators and women are always victims. So there's this myth that men can't be survivors, which makes it especially difficult for them to get support and to be believed. And an example of this is maybe in the movie Horrible Bosses or Wedding Crashers, where you see a scene that a man is actually being sexually assaulted by a woman, but it's seen as funny and people are supposed to be laughing. And if the scene was switched, the genders were switched, it would look very different and it would look probably quite horrifying for viewers and not funny. So in having these conversations about consent, it's important for us to discuss why some might say yes even if they don't mean it, and how things like power as well as other obstacles might influence a situation, making someone feel, might influence what someone feels safe to say or not to say in a conversation. So in recent conversation with boys in grades 11 and 12, they consistently repeated that it wasn't fair that boys are expected to read girls' minds and worried that girls might regret an experience and then accuse them. So these ideas are particularly heightened right now in this kind of Me Too movement and in this world currently. So when discussing any of these obstacles, the goal is not necessarily to solve or fix anything. Often the most important thing is asking youth what they feel obstacles to consent might be in their own relationships. So getting them to articulate the obstacles can help increase their awareness and encourage them to think critically about factors they may have never named or acknowledged before. So in general, when discussing obstacles, the goal is not to tell them not to do it, it just complicates it. So it makes it more difficult for us to be freely given, but doesn't mean that it's not possible. So again, when talking about consent, it's also important to emphasize that consent is not only saying no, but also being able to get consent from things, for things that people want to do. That is yes, and silence is certainly not a way of showing consent. So what we're going to do next is go through a few of the obstacles and looking at common beliefs that you have when these messages that adults should be sending.
All right, so the first obstacle we're going to be talking about is alcohol and drugs. So as you can see on the slide, one of the most common beliefs and things that youth will bring up in conversation is this idea that if I'm intoxicated, I'm not responsible for my actions. According to the World Health Organization, men are more likely to act violently while drunk because they don't think they will be held accountable. This is really significant. What it's telling us is that alcohol can easily become an excuse for violent or harmful behavior. because as a society, we tend to apportion less blame when people are intoxicated. In combination with reduced feelings of responsibility, we also know that youth are likely to combine alcohol and drugs with sexual activity. So, a Canadian study completed in 2003 indicated that 39% of grade 9 males and 28% of grade 9 females used alcohol or drugs prior to their last sexual intercourse. So, when we're talking about all of this with youth, it's really important to get them to rethink how responsibility works when it comes to alcohol and drugs. So, again, we do take a harm reduction approach. Um, you know, saying we hope youth will make educated choices, but we want to focus on how they can be as safe as possible and ensure that if they are taking part in risky behavior, we hope that they don't, but if they take part in that risky behavior, that they still have the skills to get consent. So one major thing that we really emphasize is not only does responsibility still apply, but it's actually heightened if you or your partner are under the influence. As part of this, it's really important that we are teaching them practical skills, which we're going to be looking at shortly, both to identify, well, what are signs that your partner is not able to consent? Often when we talk about this with youth, they'll say, oh, well, if they're passed out, they can't consent. And yes, that's of course true. But they might be at a stage earlier than that where really consent is not possible. So helping youth to identify specific signs that let them know, okay, maybe this person is not at full capacity. And similarly, giving them language to check in with a partner. And we'll be looking through some examples of those shortly.
So another obstacle that we mentioned is power dynamics. So there's a whole bunch of power dynamics, different types. And we like to kind of ask students and youth, like, what are those? What might they look like? So things that might come up are age, sexual experience, social status, physical stature, financial power, job status. And power dynamics can take many forms. These may include the obvious ones like a teacher and student, employee and employer, but it's so important for students to go further into power dynamics that might affect their real situation. So when it comes to power dynamics, one thing we often hear youth say is that age is just a number. And yes, there might be lots of relationships where there isn't necessarily an issue with consent when they are different ages. However, this power dynamic does complicate it. And it's important to emphasize that often for youth, age is a marker of maturity, of vulnerability, and experience. And so when you are with someone who might be more experienced, who might be older, youth might feel that they should be at that level and they should be doing things that they might not be ready at that point. So as with all of the obstacles to consent, the first is to support youth in identifying those power dynamics in their own lives and identify the risk that they might be coming into because of that power dynamic. So it's also important to help youth realize that in certain situations, they may be the ones in a place of power. And in other situations, they may be with someone who has more power than them. For some of these, the answer is not that consent can never be had when power dynamics are at play, but that it's important to be aware of it and increase responsibility for the person in power to check in. Making absolutely clear that there are no negative ramifications for saying no.
So the next obstacle that we'll look at is awkwardness. And as Ayla had mentioned, this is, I think, the most common thing in every single time I've had conversations with youth about consent. Awkwardness is the very first thing they bring up. And it really gets at this very rooted idea that talking about sex is, way too awkward. And when we don't talk, unfortunately, it means that there are going to be more complications because you can't always read someone else's mind. And as we've mentioned before, they don't have examples. So even if they want to check in, they don't really know how to go about doing it. And they haven't seen this work successfully. So as part of this, it's really important to give youth language that they can use to check in. Also to emphasize, well, what are the benefits of talking? So not only you need to do this to check off your consent box, but that it's actually going to increase the pleasure of the experience, right? That it's going to increase their comfort with someone, and it's going to prevent confusion, prevent them from getting into a situation that they don't want to be. Something we also like to talk about is that, yes, it might be awkward, and that's okay. And in real life, these things are usually awkward. And so even getting past that point when they bring it up in the conversation and say, yeah, it's going to be awkward, but that's also okay. And we can still do what needs to be done. And so we'll look at some examples of how they can actually use language.
So another one of the obstacles is personal pressures. So youth often say that they don't outright hear explicit pressures from friends. So I might ask them, do we think that these pressures are implicit or explicit? And so it might not be people saying you should be doing this, but there's still just as strong a pressure there. So this can come from seeing others moving faster than you, or the way sexual histories are talked about in friend groups. So what this person did or what that person did. So youth may be thinking everyone is having sex and I should be too. So pressures that take place in relationships are often described as even stronger because of the expectations of what you should be doing based on how long you've been together. And it's important to emphasize that everyone, the idea everyone is talking about sex, not everyone is having sex. That it's this assumption that if we're talking about it, and the more people are talking about it and assuming that they're doing it, that everybody's doing it. And so we really want to emphasize that everyone is at their own stage, and that your experience in a sexual experience will be better and more comfortable and pleasurable if you are at a place where you feel ready. So it's helpful to do some of that myth busting about how many youth are actually engaging in sexual activity, as often as the perception is far greater than the reality. According to a 2010 Canadian Community Health Survey, 30% of teens aged 15 to 17 have engaged in sexual activity at least once. And so that leaves a whole big percentage, 70%, that aren't.
All right, so we have a few more of these things to go through. What we've talked about so far are some of the obstacles. We also want to talk about some assumptions that youth might be bringing to the conversation and that will need to be addressed. So, some of these might be things like, what guy wouldn't want to have sex? Women don't sexually assault other women. It's usually going to happen between strangers. Consent is something you need for sexual situations only. So what we'll take the next few minutes is go through some of these assumptions and talk about how you can actually address them. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is the idea of men in survivorship. And often youth will come in with an idea that men can't be assaulted. And as we talked about, this really goes to this root idea that men must always want sex. So, of course, once this is happening, there are a lot of challenges because, one, there's pressure on young boys around what they expect they should want for themselves, which can make it hard for them to identify, do I want this? Do I not want this? And also it can mean that people of any gender that they're interacting with may assume off the bat, well, this person must want it because of their gender. There's also usually assumptions around physical strength, oh, you could have pushed them away. And as we've talked about, male survivors can be laughed at in popular movies and reality. So something that's really important to emphasize is, again, this idea that everyone has the capacity to be harmed as well as to do harm. That while statistically it is true that more women are experience assault and more men are perpetrators, that is not always the case. And that really, regardless of gender, this is something that can apply to everyone.
So another assumption that is very important to question is that oftentimes sex ed is focused on opposite sex relationships. So people in queer relationships may not recognize themselves or their partners in these messages and may not realize that pressure and assault and manipulation can happen in their same gender relationships. So by leaving LGBTQ2S+ relationships out of the conversation, we are sending a message that this content does not apply to them and leaving marginalized youth ill-equipped to ensure their relationships are consensual. So really questioning that assumption that men are perpetrators, women are victims, and it happens in these straight relationships.
All right, so we'll go through a few of these assumptions a little more quickly to make sure we have time to address all of the points. Another major one that I think we see really commonly is this idea of the alleyway, so that that assault happens between strangers. And so here, again, it's doing a little bit of myth busting on the part of adults and, being able to educate young people that most assaults happen between people who know each other, which, going back to this idea of consent, means even in relationships, even when with people you know well, that is where it's actually especially important to be getting consent, because that's where youth may not think it's needed. And we know that over half of sexual assault incidents, the perpetrator was a friend, acquaintance, or neighbor of the victim. So really emphasizing with people consent is really, really important.
The assumption that consent is only sexual can be harmful, because when we practice consent in our everyday life, we are able to use it more easily in our sexual situations. So these can really apply, as well as, we often ask students, well, what are situations you need consent? And some of the things where they really focus on is photo sharing online, other forms of physical interactions. We talk about, well, what kind of world would it be if we were able to ask if someone wanted a hug, and how much more comfortable people might be in those kind of situations. So this is something we really want to continue to talk about when we're talking about consent in a sexual context. Bring up also the other context that consent is needed.
So we spent quite a bit of time looking at possible barriers to consent and assumptions youth may bring to the conversation. Next, we're going to share some activities, techniques, and helpful practices to address these topics with youth. So what we'd like to share first is a game that we often play to explore verbal versus nonverbal consent. Usually, of course, people are in a room together, but we'll do a version of this with you over the webinar. So I'm going to show a series of faces, and when I show you the face, I'd like you to guess what emotion that face is showing. So for our first face, you can think for yourselves, does this face look content? Are they anxious, or are they tired? So decide which of those. Are they content, anxious, or tired?
If you're in a group, you can kind of say it out loud and think, what do you think?
And so for this person, they're actually anxious. Usually when I do this in workshops, the guess that I get is content. But I know for this individual person, when they feel anxious, they tend to go a little bit still, so they can become hard to read. And so this is actually how they look when they're anxious. We'll do maybe one more of these. So in this face, do you think this person is regretful, thoughtful, or worried? So take a moment, think about your answer: regretful, thoughtful, or worried. And they are feeling regret. And our final face, I'll just show you this one. The person was feeling uncomfortable. So as I said, we use this activity to prompt youth to think about verbal versus nonverbal consent, and really get them to think about how, of course, body language is important, but also, people might express an emotion differently for such a range of reasons. And it can be really dangerous when we're just relying on body language. So the next thing we usually move from here to talk about is language. So saying, all right, well, we can't just rely on body language. So what is actual words that we can use?
So we have this game where we talk about 10 ways to talk about consent. And like we said, that there aren't that many examples of how to talk about consent. We think this is so crucial to include when you're talking to youth about consent. So we often get them to look at a whole bunch of these. So we don't just show 3, we show 10 or more. And we get them to think about, what would you use in an actual situation? And we give them a lot because they don't have to be connected to every single one. They could think, this one is great, this one I would never use, and that's totally fine. Another thing, we encourage them to think about, when would you use this? Would you use this when you've known someone for a very long time? Would you use this if it's the first time you're doing something with them? Would you use this before you start, or is it more of a check-in question? Like, are you okay? And some things, for example, are you sure you're ready for this might be used before you start something new. Are you okay when the body language changes? We might ask, well, what would make you ask that question? Is it a lack of eye contact? Is it a kind of pulling away? And we talk about that to give them options of what they can say that feels right. Um, Regardless of the specific words, the key is to ensure that youth have a wealth of knowledge and language they can draw from to check in with a partner and also check in with themselves. So hopefully once they get into those situations, they can think those are some of the statements I can use. So if someone, doesn't want to have sex, we can say, listen, maybe do you want to cuddle instead? Is that okay? And it's showing that they still like them, but they don't have to partake in these kind of activities. In addition, we want to think of these can be used for our own kind of self check-in. So a phrase might be, do I feel safe? Do I like this? Does this feel good for me? Do I want to stop? Do I want to go further? And while it is always the initiator who should be asking these questions, it's important for us to learn to know ourselves as best we can. So by going over these kind of specific examples of language, youth are able to build a kind of toolbox they can use in future relationships and interactions.
So when you are having these types of conversation with youth, you obviously want to do your best to set up the space to be as comfortable as possible for them to have the conversation. And of course, the context may change if you are a professional who's speaking with a group of youth or one, individual on their own, if you're a parent. So, these will need to be shifted. But the basic idea is that often coming into this conversation, especially with an adult, youth might be wary, they might be a little bit uncomfortable. So it's really important to do your best to lay down some ground rules to make sure that it is a space where it can be a conversation. So a few parameters we always like to talk about is, questions are very encouraged. And the best way that this is going to work is if it's really a dialogue. I know we're talking a lot right now, but usually we really see our role as asking a lot of questions and having the young people come up with the answers, because that's really going to prompt them to reflect more deeply. We also talk about no hierarchy of knowledge. And while we as adults in the conversation, of course, are bringing knowledge and experience that youth in the room may not have, it's really important to also understand and recognize for them that, they know their context, their social scene best. They know what it is that they've gone through in their own lived experience. And we're encouraging them to share that knowledge, those perspectives as well. And that's going to really enrich the conversation. We also often like to use this word called calling in. What this means is really making sure that everyone in the room is involved in the conversation. And that means especially, often when we have these conversations, we have young people who are saying things that might seem harmful or that might seem ignorant or uninformed. And you might even be nervous about, well, how will this make someone else in the room feel? And while, of course, the first priority is ensuring everyone is safe, it's important that we don't just shut that person down and say, no, that's inappropriate, you need to leave. But instead we recognize, well, where did that inappropriate comment come from? Are they nervous? Are they feeling uncomfortable? Maybe they're reflecting on an experience that they've had and this is their way of expressing it. So making sure that instead we actually draw them into the conversation by saying, well, can you expand on what you mean by that? How might that make someone feel? But that we're not shutting that person down. Of course, we talk about confidentiality and the fact that, there are certain things that you cannot keep confidential if it's a matter of safety. However, other types of information you can say, well, I'm not going to spread this around. We're not going to share this outside of the room. And of course, taking the perspective of providing active listening, really creating a space for them to share their ideas and providing support when it's possible. So
we're going to go over some do's and don'ts. And I might go over this relatively quickly, but so again, we call people in, we create that open space, and most important to call in folks who might have those kind of problematic ideas. Where did they get it from? Who did they learn that from? We want to be asking open-ended questions. So avoid obvious kind of yes or no questions, and leave the discussion open for youth to share their real opinions and feelings, because they really will be listening to each other and learning from each other. So provide language, tools, and concrete strategies you can use to ask for and express consent. So we're really focusing on skill building. Discuss non-sexual consent, as well as model consent in your own behavior and interactions with youth.
And I think we'll show don'ts, but we might move on to some of the examples so you can see this in action.
So we have lecture, judge, or shame. Act as if there aren't survivors in the room, because there so often are. We don't want to be reinforcing gender stereotypes, and we don't want to be assuming that the experience and learning stages of participants, because we really don't know.
So what we're going to do is look at some frequently asked questions that we get from youth and possible ways that you can answer them. I know we've got just a few minutes left, so we'll go through one or two. So a very common one that we get is, well, what did this person expect wearing that outfit? So you can consider for yourself, if you got this question, what you might want to say. Some of the things that we really like to bring up is prompting them to think a little bit more deeply. I really think that the best way to talk about any of these is asking questions back rather than just responding, because they're more likely to listen to themselves than to us. So asking them, what are other reasons someone might want to wear revealing clothing? Maybe it's hot outside, expresses personal style, whatever it is. I also sometimes ask, if they're saying, well, she's asking for it, well, what exactly is that person asking for? And having them think more deeply, what does that mean? Or, what exactly is it that we think this person should expect and why? How might it feel if you were hurt and someone made that comment about you? So really moving to empathy. The biggest thing here is really asking questions in response so that they can think more deeply.
We can give one more example. Sure. So you might have a question about what if we're both drunk? And this is such a common question. So one way, you can think for yourself how you might answer it, but we certainly ask questions like, what are some signs that someone is unable to consent? And that's focusing on the consent as care. The idea that we should be looking out for that person. It's our responsibility to make sure that we're not harming them. Other things we might ask is, does responsibility change when you're drunk? And we focus more on getting back to that definition, as well as, what are some ways we can make sure that that person is fully able to consent, and focusing on those kind of check-in questions that we can make sure that they're there.
Okay, so our last one that we have is, what if someone says yes and then they regret it? And so again, and I think we talked about this idea a little bit earlier, our question is always, what might lead someone to regret an encounter? Whether it's coercion, whether things move too fast, whether they were sharing personal details. So really getting at the emotion that comes behind the question, and instead saying, this person is saying they feel hurt. Even if you didn't intend to cause harm, it still happened. So what can you do to support them? Moving them from that place of fear to saying, what can you do as a support? So we have covered quite a few, And the second part of that is, if someone approaches you, what can you do for support? And that's listen, apologize, and reflect.
And it's really getting at the idea that behind all of this is our emphasis on empathy and empathy building.
All right, so we have our takeaways here.
And again, we're from an organization called Canvas Arts Action Programs, and please feel free to get in touch with us if you do have any further questions. You can reach us at info, I-N-F-O, at canvasprograms.com. And you can also email Pearl. And you can also check out our website, canvasprograms.ca, and there's all of our contact information. So we're very happy. If you come up with a question later on and you want us to answer it, please feel free to get in touch.
All right, well, thank you everyone so much for participating today and have a wonderful afternoon.